Chapter 5. From an upstairs window, Cassie and I watched Sarah and Papa talking outside. I'd never seen Papa so upset. Maybe once before, when he was afraid Sarah might not stay and marry him, but that had been a long time ago. "Papa's mad," said Cassie. She leaned against me. "No, Cassie, he's upset. He thought his father was dead." "Why isn't he glad to see him?" Cassie looked up at me. "Where has grandfather been?" I smiled at how natural the word grandfather was to Cassie. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Maybe he was lost," said Cassie. "Maybe." "That's what happened," said Cassie firmly. "He was lost." We watched Sarah talking to Papa. Papa stood silent, not even looking at her. "Will everything be all right?" Cassie asked at last. She sounded so sad. "Everything will be fine," I said. "You'll see." "I like grandfather," Cassie said after a moment. Cassie left, and I knew that she was going downstairs to ask grandfather more questions. "I like grandfather, too," I said out loud in an empty room. "I do." Outside, Sarah reached out and put her arms around Papa, but after a moment, Papa walked off to the barn, leading Bess. Sarah stood still for a moment, then she pulled her coat around her and followed Papa into the barn. I could hear Cassie's voice down in the kitchen, going on and on like the wind. Sometimes grandfather would say something, his voice low, his sentences short. Slowly I walked down the stairs and into the kitchen. "I am almost 4.5 years old, you know," said Cassie. "You told me that," said grandfather. "I was born here." "So was I," said grandfather grumpily. "And I was very little," said Cassie. "I was little," said grandfather. Cassie took a breath. "I was very little, so little," said Cassie, "that I had to sleep in a little box by the stove, and I ate every hour, and I cried, and I threw up." Grandfather grunted. "You win," he said. "It will be nice to know my grandfather," I said. Grandfather looked at me, his eyes so sharp and blue. He walked to the door and put on his coat. "I'm not nice," he said. "Don't go thinking that, Caleb." The kitchen door opened and Sarah came in. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" she said to grandfather. "I didn't know if I would be welcome in your house," said grandfather. "You are Jacob's father," said Sarah. "Of course you are welcome." "Does Jacob welcome me?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer. She walked to the stove to pour a cup of coffee. "That's what I thought," said grandfather. He put on his hat. "Where are you going?" asked Sarah. "Taking a walk," said grandfather. "I'll go with you," said Sarah. "No," said grandfather. "I know the farm. It was once mine, you know." "I'll go," I said. "I'd like to." "Aren't you late for school?" asked Sarah. "There is no school," I said. "Remember? Then help Jacob with the chores, Caleb." "What about me?" asked Cassie. Grandfather peered at all of us for a moment. Then he turned and went out the door. "Grandfather doesn't like us," said Cassie. "No, he doesn't," I said. Sarah sighed and walked to the window to watch grandfather walk down the road by the paddock fence. "He doesn't know you," she said softly. "He will like you." "Does he like Papa?" asked Cassie. Sarah didn't answer. "Does Papa like him?" asked Cassie. Sarah turned from the window. "Have you brushed your hair, Cassie?" "Chores, Caleb," she said briskly. I knew there wouldn't be any more questions or answers. Papa was in the barn, but he wasn't cleaning the stalls. He was standing in the open doorway, looking out over the meadows and the slough, filled with snow. He was also watching grandfather walking down the road. "Papa?" Papa didn't answer me right away. "The paddock gate needs fixin'," he said, his voice soft. "Papa? Cassie wonders—" I stopped as Papa looked straight at me. "Cassie wonders what?" he repeated. I took a breath. "Cassie wonders why you aren't happy to see your father, if you thought he was dead." Papa knew I was asking for me too. "Cassie's life is simple, Caleb. She thinks life is good and fair, and everyone does the right thing." We both watched grandfather walk away down the road. "But life is good and fair," I said. "Isn't it?" Papa sighed. "Sometimes, Caleb, but sometimes people do the wrong thing." "Did grandfather do the wrong thing?" Papa winced at the name grandfather. It did not come as easy for him as for Cassie. Papa looked at me again. "You know, Caleb, you're almost as tall as I am. When did that happen?" Papa turned and walked back into the barn and picked up his shovel. "The gate, Caleb," his voice soft. He bent over and began to clean out the stalls, his arm rising and falling in a regular rhythm, up and down, up and down, up and down. I mended the gate and looked up once to see Grandfather far away in the west meadow. When I looked up again, he was gone. Later, when I went to the barn to put away the fence wire, Sarah and Papa were talking. They didn't see me, and I didn't mean to listen, but I was afraid to move. "You should talk to John," said Sarah. "Perhaps if you just talk about it." "That's your way, Sarah," interrupted Papa. "I thought it was our way, Jacob." Papa dropped his shovel and looked at Sarah. "There's nothing to talk about. He walked away from us, Sarah. I was younger than Caleb. He walked away and left us to wait and wonder." Papa's voice grew louder. "Every day I looked down that road for him. Every day." Papa was shouting now. "That shouldn't happen to a boy. That shouldn't happen to anyone." Sarah put her arms around Papa. "He's old and tired, Jacob. Please talk to him." "What does he want after all this time?" asked Papa. "He could have written me a letter. Why didn't he write me a letter?" Papa's voice sounded sad. Papa walked over to the barn to look outside. He didn't see me in the shadows. "I could forgive him for dying, but I will never, never forgive him for walking away," he said. "Talk to him," whispered Sarah. I stood still as a stone. "You can tell him he can stay until he's well enough to go," said Papa. "You can tell him that yourself, Jacob," said Sarah. "You are his son." She walked out of the barn, past Papa, past me. I stood quietly for a long time. Then when I heard Papa begin to shovel hay again, I went out into the winter day. Dusk came, and it was colder. Sarah and Cassie and I set the table for supper. Papa came in at last. He looked around. Sarah shook her head. "He hasn't come back from his walk." Papa looked out the window. Daylight was nearly gone. Papa washed his hands. "Is supper ready?" he asked. "We can't eat without Grandfather," said Cassie. Papa dried his hands. He sat down at the table. "We ate without him all these years," he said firmly. "We can eat without him tonight." "I'll go look for him," I said. "Caleb, sit down." Papa's voice was sharp. I sat down. "I think we should wait for him, Jacob," said Sarah. "He's our guest." Papa stood up angrily. "A guest? Of all things he is not." The door opened and Papa stopped. Grandfather came in and took off his coat, then saw Papa standing. "Sorry to be late," said Grandfather. "I lost my way. It's been a long time." His voice trailed off. "You should have eaten without me." "That's what Papa said," said Cassie. Grandfather looked at Papa. "Your Papa was right," Grandfather said. Grandfather sat at his place. Papa sat too. "Grace, Caleb," said Sarah. "Thank you for our food," I said, "and thank you for friends who came to share it." "That means you, Grandfather," said Cassie. "I know, Cassie," said Grandfather softly. He turned to Papa. "I see you cut down a stand of trees in the west meadow near the barn." "Don't know if I would have done that. I fell out of one of those trees once," he said to me. Papa said nothing. "Do you like children?" asked Cassie, staring at Grandfather. Grandfather took a spoonful of soup. "Do you like children?" asked Cassie again. Sarah reached out her hand and put it on Cassie's arm to stop her talk. "Don't know many," said Grandfather. "Do you like the ones you know?" "No," said Grandfather. Cassie was surprised at Grandfather's answer. Her mouth fell open. "But what about Papa?" asked Cassie. "Did you like Papa when he was little?" "Cassie, eat," said Papa. "But—" "Hush," said Sarah. Cassie was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Grandfather. "You are not a nice man," she said. "Now, I told you that," said Grandfather. No one spoke for the rest of the meal. Even Cassie was quiet. Lottie and Nick watched us, waiting for talk, but there was no talk. "Good night, Grandfather." I stood in the doorway of his bedroom. His oil lamp was burning. Grandfather stood by the window looking out. "There's a moon," he said. I went over and saw the moonlight on the barn. the meadows, the road going to town. I watched a lot of moons from this room, said Grandfather. You must have missed the farm, I said. Grandfather was silent. You could read Anna's journals, I said. They're on the table. You could read all about the farm and about us while you were gone. Grandfather didn't turn around. I picked up one of Anna's journals and opened it. I began to read to Grandfather. Papa married Sarah on a summer day. There were no clouds in the sky, and Papa picked up Sarah in his arms and whirled her around and around, her white dress and veil surrounding them like the summer wind. Caleb was excited and happy. He burst into tears. Everybody was happy. There was silence, but Grandfather was looking at me. I did cry, I remember, I said, and I was happy. Good night, Caleb, he said finally. Close the door behind you. Just before I closed the door, Seal crept into Grandfather's room and jumped into his bed. Grandfather hasn't opened Anna's journals. He hasn't read mine. He doesn't talk to Papa, only to Sarah, who makes him talk to her. Sometimes to Cassie and me. I'm glad Grandfather came, but I don't like the silence. Chapter 6. I didn't have to tell Sarah about Grandfather's pills after all. It was the dogs, Lottie, who showed her in the end, and Grandfather running after Lottie all over the house. All that noise, the dogs. There was no school for the next few days. The cold was hard for the horses and children. I would have liked it any other time, staying home, but not in this house, not with Papa and Grandfather passing each other without talking. The only sounds in the house, the clicking of Sarah's needles, Cassie's chattering, men batting a marble across the floor. 2 times I heard Sarah and Papa's voices, sharp and soft at the same time, behind their closed bedroom door. Once Papa had burst out of the room, brushing past me in the hallway. He had stayed at the barn most of the day. Why won't they talk to each other? I whispered to Sarah. They are stubborn, Caleb. But they're family, I said. I know. That's what makes it so hard. Can't you do something? Can't you make Papa... Caleb, Sarah interrupted me. Your Papa has to do it himself. I don't know, Sarah. Papa's angry. Will he hurt Grandfather? Sarah's look changed, and she put her arms around me. Oh, no, Caleb. They are grown-up men. They won't do that. They will talk about their differences. Sarah? Yes, Caleb? I think Grandfather is sick. Sarah looked at me closely. Why do you say that, Caleb? The door opened, and Grandfather came into the kitchen. The dogs followed, snow on their noses. Grandfather stamped his feet, leaving snow on the rug by the door. He sat down, the dogs surrounding him. They've adopted you, Lottie and Nick, said Sarah. And Seal, she added, as Seal jumped out of her basket and came over to Grandfather. Page 62. Grandfather was out of breath. Grandfather! Cassie came into the kitchen and leaned against Grandfather. I drew 7 more pictures of you. She had dozens of pictures of Grandfather. Grandfather sitting, running, standing, sleeping, riding a horse. Grandfather was much larger than the horse, and Grandfather on the barn roof. Cassie has adopted you too, said Sarah, smiling. Grandfather looked at Cassie quickly, then away again, not inviting any questions from her. He stroked Lottie and Nick. We always had good farm dogs here. Grandfather looked surprised at his own memory, or maybe he was surprised he was talking about his memories. What kind of dogs did you have? I asked. What were their names? Grandfather raised his eyebrows. You'll write about this, won't you? Maybe. Grandfather looked at my journal on the table, then shrugged his shoulders. He leaned back in his chair. Pal was the big one, part hound with long ears. She could jump over the tallest fences. Jacob. He stopped for a moment. Jacob used to try to get her to jump over the cattle. Did she jump over a cow? Asked Cassie. Don't know that, said Grandfather. And then there was Maudie, Grandfather went on. She was small and black, like Lottie here. Lottie wagged her tail at the sound of her name. I'm at the bottom of page 63. There are about 5 or 6 pages left. Please read with your child. Encourage your child to read the rest of chapter 6.